It's 585 BCE, and two massive armies are locked in brutal combat when suddenly, at high noon, the sun begins to disappear. Panic spreads like wildfire. Soldiers drop their weapons. Generals fall to their knees. But 500 miles away in Babylon, a group of men in long robes calmly mark their clay tablets and mutter, "Right on schedule." The ancient world lived in terror of eclipses. When the sun darkened or the moon turned blood red, entire civilizations interpreted these events as divine wrath, impending doom, or the literal end of the world. Kings would halt military campaigns. Priests would perform frantic rituals. Common people would hide in their homes, convinced that the gods were about to destroy everything they knew. But in the towering ziggurats of Babylon, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated the Mesopotamian skyline, something extraordinary was happening. An elite brotherhood of scholar priests had accomplished the impossible. They had reduced the apparent chaos of the heavens to pure mathematical order. While the rest of humanity cowered in fear at celestial events, these men could predict them with clockwork precision. The Neo-Babylonian Empire wasn't just another ancient kingdom built on military conquest and agricultural surplus. It was history's first true technocracy, a civilization where mathematical knowledge translated directly into political power. The priest astronomers who worked in the upper chambers of the ziggurats weren't just religious figures. They were the world's first professional scientists, and their laboratory was the entire night sky. Consider the psychological revolution this represented. In a world where supernatural explanations dominated every aspect of life, these Babylonian scholars had discovered something that would fundamentally change human consciousness. The universe operated according to mathematical laws that could be understood, calculated, and predicted. It wasn't divine caprice, it was cosmic mechanics. Their breakthrough came from combining three revolutionary insights that no other ancient civilization had achieved simultaneously. First, they realized that careful, systematic observation over long periods could reveal hidden patterns in apparently random events. Second, they developed mathematical tools sophisticated enough to handle complex calculations involving enormous numbers and precise fractions. Third, and most importantly, they separated the mechanical prediction of celestial events from their religious interpretation. This last point cannot be overstated. While other cultures mixed astronomy with astrology, mythology with mathematics, the Babylonians created distinct tracks, one for calculating when events would occur, pure science, and another for interpreting what they meant, applied theology. It was the first systematic separation of how from why, the foundation of all modern scientific methodology. The scale of their achievement becomes clear when we examine their surviving records. The astronomical diaries of Babylon contain over 700 years of systematic observations, recorded with obsessive precision. These weren't casual stargazing notes. They were scientific datasets more comprehensive than anything Europe would compile until the Renaissance. But raw data was only the beginning. The Babylonians had developed what modern mathematicians recognize as sophisticated algorithmic thinking. They created step-by-step procedures for calculating planetary positions, eclipse timing, and seasonal variations. These weren't mystical formulas. They were computational algorithms expressed in cuneiform script on clay tablets. Their mathematical system was perfectly suited for astronomical calculation. The base 60 numbering system they inherited from the Sumerians allowed them to work with fractions and large numbers in ways that other ancient number systems couldn't handle. When you realize that we still use their 360-degree circle, their 60-minute hour, and their 60-second minute, you begin to understand the practical genius of their mathematical choices. The Babylonian approach to eclipse prediction reveals the sophistication of their thinking. They had identified what modern astronomers call the Saros cycle, a period of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after which eclipse patterns repeat. But they went far beyond this basic cycle, developing mathematical models that could predict not just when eclipses would occur, but their duration, intensity, and geographical visibility. The accuracy they achieved using only naked-eye observation and mathematical calculation is staggering. Their predictions of lunar eclipses typically had errors of less than 10 minutes. For solar eclipses, which are far more complex to calculate, they achieved precision within 30 minutes. This level of accuracy wouldn't be surpassed until the invention of precision mechanical clocks in the 17th century. Greek historians who visited Babylon were amazed by what they found. Herodotus wrote with obvious awe about the Chaldeans, as Greeks called Babylonian astronomers, who could predict eclipses of the sun and moon so accurately that they never fail. For Greeks who were just beginning to develop natural philosophy, this seemed almost supernatural. But the Babylonians weren't content to predict just eclipses. They had developed comprehensive mathematical models for all visible planetary motion, calculating future positions with precision that would make Copernicus envious. Their planetary ephemerides were so accurate that later Greek astronomers adopted them wholesale, and Ptolemy based much of his famous Almagest on Babylonian data and methods. This wasn't isolated genius. It was systematic scientific culture. Multiple generations of scholar priests had built upon each other's work, creating an intellectual tradition that valued precision, verification, and mathematical elegance above all else. They had created something that wouldn't exist again until the scientific revolution. A community of researchers dedicated to understanding the universe through pure mathematical analysis. In the Ziggurat observation chambers of ancient Babylon, while the rest of the world still trembled at eclipses as divine omens, a group of ancient scientists had achieved something that would define the future of human knowledge. They had proven that the universe was comprehensible, predictable, and fundamentally mathematical. It was the birth of science as we know it, occurring over 1,000 years before Europe would even attempt similar achievements. While Greek philosophers were still debating whether the earth was flat or round, Babylonian mathematicians had already created algorithms so precise they could tell you exactly where Jupiter would be in the sky 400 years in the future, and be accurate to within 1% of the actual position. Deep within the Esagila temple complex, the high priest Nabu-Ramannu was completing what historians now recognize as humanity's first mathematical theory of planetary motion. It was 490 BCE, and this Babylonian genius was putting the finishing touches on a system of equations that could predict the exact position of any planet at any future date. He was doing algebra with the cosmos, and he was doing it 1,000 years before the word algebra would even exist. The mathematical sophistication of the Babylonian system is breathtaking when you understand what they actually achieved. They had developed what modern mathematicians call linear zigzag functions, equations that described planetary motion as a series of linear segments with variable velocities. It was computational astronomy expressed in cuneiform, and it worked with stunning precision. The foundation of their system was the recognition that planets don't move at constant speeds. They accelerate and decelerate in predictable patterns. They had discovered what modern astronomers call retrograde motion, the periods when planets appear to move backward against the background of stars. But while later Greek astronomers would try to explain this with complicated systems of circles within circles, the Babylonians simply reduced it to mathematical equations. Their precision was absolutely terrifying in its accuracy. The procedure texts found in Babylonian ruins contain algorithmic instructions that could calculate Jupiter's position with less than 1% error over a 400-year period. To put this in perspective, This is more accurate than the predictions Copernicus made in the 16th century using his revolutionary heliocentric model. The secret of their precision lay in a unique combination of advanced mathematics and systematic observation that no other ancient civilization had achieved. They had developed mathematical notation systems that could handle enormous numbers and complex fractions. Their base 60 system allowed them to perform calculations that would have been impossible in other numerical systems. But perhaps most impressive was their understanding of periodicity, the concept that all celestial phenomena follow complex but predictable cycles. For lunar eclipses, they had identified not just the basic 18-year Saros cycle, but also the 669-year Super Saros that allowed them to predict eclipses with extraordinary accuracy across multiple centuries. The Babylonian methodology was revolutionary because it completely separated mathematical prediction from religious interpretation. Although they believed the gods controlled the stars, their calculations worked independently of theological beliefs. It was the first pure application of the scientific method: observation, mathematical hypothesis, prediction, and verification. Their planetary ephemerides were masterpieces of ancient computation. These tables could predict the position of any planet for any date hundreds of years in advance. They calculated not just angular position, but also apparent distance, brightness, and velocity of each celestial body. It was computational astronomy on clay tablets. The astronomer Seleucus of Babylon, working in the 3rd century BCE, had developed mathematical models of the solar system that anticipated key aspects of Copernicus's heliocentric model. Using Babylonian mathematics, he had calculated that the Earth moved around the Sun, and that this explained the apparent behavior of the planets. It was mathematical heliocentrism 1,800 years before Copernicus. But the Babylonians weren't content with predicting planetary positions. They had developed mathematical models for far more complex phenomena. They could calculate the exact duration of daylight throughout the year, predict lunar phases to the minute, and determine planetary visibility from different geographical latitudes. Their methods for calculating eclipses were particularly sophisticated. They could predict not just when an eclipse would occur, but also its magnitude, duration, and geographical visibility. They had developed what moderns call eclipse maps, calculations showing where each eclipse would be visible and with what intensity. The precision of their lunar eclipse predictions was astonishing. Cuneiform tablets show calculations that predicted eclipses with average errors of less than 10 minutes. For solar eclipses, more complex to calculate, they achieved precision within 30 minutes. This accuracy wouldn't be exceeded until the invention of precision mechanical clocks in the 17th century. When Greeks finally gained access to this knowledge, they were stunned by Babylonian precision. Hipparchus, considered the greatest Greek astronomer, directly adopted Babylonian methods and incorporated them into his own work. Ptolemy, in his Almagest, explicitly acknowledged that his most precise data came from Chaldean observations. But perhaps most extraordinary was that all this was achieved without optical instruments, without mechanical clocks, without paper for complex calculations. Only mathematics, geometry, and systematic naked-eye observation. It was the triumph of human mind over technological limitations. The Babylonians had demonstrated something that would change the course of history. The universe followed comprehensible and predictable mathematical laws. It wasn't divine chaos, it was mathematical order. This understanding would spread throughout the ancient world, influencing scientific developments in Greece, Rome, India, and eventually medieval Europe. What the Babylonians had accomplished in their Ziggurat laboratories was nothing less than the mathematization of the cosmos. They had proven that careful observation combined with sophisticated mathematics could unlock the deepest secrets of the universe. It was the birth of mathematical astronomy, and Europe would take over a millennium to reach the same level of sophistication. Their achievement represents one of the greatest intellectual leaps in human history, the realization that the apparent complexity of celestial motion could be reduced to elegant mathematical relationships. They had tamed the cosmos with numbers, creating the foundation upon which all subsequent astronomy would be built. In 331 BCE, as Alexander the Great prepared for the most important battle of his life at Gaugamela, he made a crucial strategic decision based on calculations performed by Babylonian astronomers. They had predicted a lunar eclipse for September 20th, and when it occurred exactly as foretold, Alexander interpreted it as divine approval for his invasion of Persia. Science had become the secret weapon that conquered empires. The transformation was swift and dramatic. Once word spread throughout the ancient world that the Babylonians could predict terrifying celestial events with mathematical precision, these scholar priests suddenly found themselves as the most powerful consultants in human history. Kings who had never heard of Mesopotamia began sending embassies to Babylon, not for trade negotiations, but for access to cosmic intelligence. The court of Nebuchadnezzar II became the intellectual pilgrimage center of the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs, Persian satraps, Greek tyrants and Mediterranean princes all dispatched representatives to consult the masters of celestial prediction. It was scientific diplomacy at its most profound level. Decisions of war and peace now depended on mathematical calculations inscribed on clay tablets. The power of Babylonian astronomers transcended cultural boundaries because their knowledge was universally verifiable. It didn't matter whether a Greek king worshipped Zeus or an Egyptian pharaoh revered Ra. Eclipses occurred exactly when the Babylonians predicted. It was the first international science in history, a mathematical language that functioned independently of local beliefs and customs. But with this unprecedented influence came the most dangerous responsibility imaginable. Rulers didn't just want to know when eclipses would occur, they wanted to know what these events meant for their reigns. Babylonian astronomers found themselves walking a tightrope between scientific precision and political interpretation. A poorly interpreted eclipse could mean the difference between royal favor and execution. The Babylonian solution was ingenious. They created a complete separation between mathematical prediction and astrological interpretation. They developed two parallel traditions, one scientific, based on pure mathematical calculation, and another interpretive, based on historical experience and traditional theology. It was the first systematic division between science and religion in recorded history. The astronomical diaries of Babylon reveal how this system operated. These records, covering over 700 years of observations, documented not only celestial events, but also contemporary political developments. The astronomers had identified statistical correlations between certain celestial phenomena and terrestrial events, not because they believed in magical causation, but because they had observed historical patterns. The precision of their predictions granted them extraordinary political influence. When Babylonian astronomers announced that a lunar eclipse would occur on a specific date, kings throughout the known world adjusted their military and ceremonial plans accordingly. It was more than scientific consulting. It was indirect control over the political decisions of multiple civilizations. The most famous case was the prediction of the lunar eclipse of September 20th, 331 BCE, just before the Battle of Gaugamela between Alexander the Great and Darius III. Babylonian astronomers had calculated exactly when this lunar eclipse would occur, and both armies adjusted their strategies based on this information. Alexander, following advice from his Babylonian astronomers, interpreted the eclipse as favorable to his cause, and indeed achieved a decisive victory. But perhaps more important than their influence on individual battles was their impact on the development of international diplomacy. Treaties began, including clauses based on celestial events. Coronation ceremonies were scheduled according to astronomical calculations. Official calendars were adjusted according to Babylonian predictions. It was the first globalization based on scientific knowledge. The Greeks, initially skeptical, soon became the most enthusiastic students of Babylonian methods. Pythagoras, Thales, Anaxagoras, and other Greek philosophers traveled to Babylon to study celestial mathematics. But what they found surprised them. It wasn't Oriental mysticism, but pure mathematics applied with extraordinary precision. Hipparchus, the greatest Greek astronomer, directly adopted Babylonian methods and incorporated them into Hellenic tradition. His famous discovery of the precession of the equinoxes was based on comparisons between contemporary Greek observations and Babylonian records from centuries earlier. It was collaborative science across cultural and temporal boundaries. The Roman Empire, pragmatic as always, institutionalized Babylonian knowledge. Roman emperors maintained Chaldean astronomers at their courts, not so much from superstitious beliefs, but for the practical utility of being able to predict events that affected public morale. It was scientific administration of political power. But the real revolution occurred in the commercial sphere. Merchants began using astronomical predictions to plan their journeys. They knew that eclipses caused panic in certain cities, creating commercial opportunities. They understood lunar cycles that affected tides, optimizing their shipping routes. It was the birth of scientifically informed commerce. The Babylonians had created something deeper than an astronomical prediction system. They had demonstrated that precise knowledge was convertible into political and economic power. It was the first historical demonstration that science could transform power relationships between civilizations. Their influence spread along trade routes connecting India, China, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Babylonian methods adapted to different cultures, but the mathematical foundation remained invariable. It was the universality of mathematics applied globally for the first time. When Babylon finally fell under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, its scientific legacy survived because it was too valuable to destroy. Conquerors adopted Babylonian astronomers, preserved their libraries, and continued their traditions. It was the first time in history that scientific knowledge transcended political and cultural boundaries. The Babylonian achievement represented a fundamental shift in human civilization. They had proven that intellectual superiority could translate into real-world power. Kings and emperors, no matter how mighty their armies, found themselves dependent on men who could decode the mathematical language of the cosmos. This dependency created a new form of international relations based on scientific expertise rather than military might. Babylonian astronomers became the first scientific ambassadors, carrying mathematical knowledge that was more valuable than gold and more powerful than armies. In the Ziggurats of Babylon, a group of mathematicians had achieved something that would define the future of human civilization. They had demonstrated that precise knowledge was real power. It was the birth of scientific meritocracy, where the ability to predict the future became tangible political influence. When Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter in 1610 and discovered that its moons followed predictable orbits, he was essentially confirming mathematical principles that Babylonian astronomers had applied 2 millennia earlier. The difference? The ancient masters had achieved the same precision using only mathematics, while the father of modern science needed optical instruments to reach similar conclusions. The journey of Babylonian knowledge from ancient Mesopotamia to Renaissance Europe reads like the greatest intellectual adventure story ever told. When the last Babylonian astronomer closed his observatory in the 3rd century CE, their astronomical tables didn't vanish. They began an epic journey across cultures, languages, and continents that would span over a millennium. The Arabs became the first conscious inheritors of the Babylonian legacy. When they conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE, they discovered libraries filled with cuneiform tablets containing astronomical calculations. The scholars of Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, realized they had uncovered a scientific treasure. They systematically translated Babylonian texts, preserving not just the data, but the mathematical methods. Al-Battani, the great 9th century Arab astronomer, based his famous astronomical tables directly on Babylonian methods. His calculations of the solar year length and equinoctial precession improved upon Ptolemy's figures precisely because he had access to Babylonian records covering much longer periods. It was scientific continuity across cultural boundaries. Arab astronomers didn't just preserve Babylonian knowledge, they expanded and refined it. They used ancient mathematical methods to create instruments like the astrolabe, which enabled portable astronomical calculations. Knowledge that had been born in Babylon's brick towers now traveled the trade routes of the Islamic world. The transmission to Western Europe was more complex and delayed. For centuries, European scholars had lost contact with ancient scientific traditions. They lived in what historians call medieval scientific amnesia, an era when the achievements of antiquity had become vague rumors and distorted superstitions. The European Renaissance of astronomical knowledge began with Arabic to Latin translations in the 12th century. Gerard of Cremona, Adelard of Bath, and other European translators encountered Arabic texts describing astronomical prediction methods of incredible precision. But what they didn't know was that these methods traced back to the Babylonians. When Copernicus developed his heliocentric model in the 16th century, he used observational data that, unknown to him, traced back to Babylonian ephemerides. His calculations of planetary orbital periods differed by less than 1% from Babylonian values calculated 2,000 years earlier. It was scientific rediscovery disguised as innovation. The historical irony is extraordinary. The Renaissance European discoveries were largely rediscoveries of ancient science. Tycho Brahe, famous for his precise astronomical observations, achieved accuracies that Babylonians had exceeded using only mathematics. Kepler, when he discovered the laws of planetary motion, was formalizing principles that ancient astronomers had applied intuitively. Galileo, when he observed Jupiter's moons and predicted their eclipses, was applying the same mathematical principles Babylonians had used for lunar eclipses. The difference was that he needed a telescope to see phenomena that the ancients had deduced purely through mathematical calculation. The true revelation came in the 19th century when archaeologists began deciphering Babylonian cuneiform tablets. Assyriologists found themselves confronting astronomical calculations of a precision that dwarfed contemporary achievements. It was like discovering that a supposedly primitive civilization had developed computers 1,000 years before us. Modern mathematicians studying Babylonian methods realized they had anticipated developments that Europe wouldn't reach until the 17th century. They had used trigonometric functions before trigonometry was formally invented. They had applied differential calculus before Newton and Leibniz. It was mathematical sophistication that challenged every conception about scientific progress. In modern computers, when calculating planetary positions, use algorithms that are refinements of Babylonian methods. Eclipse prediction programs are based on cycles that ancient astronomers had identified millennia ago. It was scientific continuity across 2,500 years of history. But perhaps the most important Babylonian legacy wasn't their specific calculations, but their methodology. They had demonstrated that the universe followed comprehensible mathematical laws, that systematic observation could reveal hidden patterns, and that scientific knowledge was cumulative and transcultural. It was modern scientific methodology, developed on clay tablets. Their influence extends to our present day. The 360 degrees of a circle, the 60 divisions of each degree, the 24 hours of the day divided into 60 minutes. All these are direct legacies of the Babylonian mathematical system. Every time we look at a clock or use geographical coordinates, we're using mathematics developed in Babylon's towers. NASA, when planning space missions, uses principles of celestial mechanics that trace back to the Babylonians. The algorithms that predict satellite positions are direct descendants of Babylonian ephemerides, its ancient science applied to modern space exploration. Full recognition of the Babylonian legacy came only in the 20th century, when historians of science began re-evaluating the contributions of non-European civilizations. They realized that the European scientific revolution hadn't been innovation from nothing, but the culmination of scientific traditions reaching back to antiquity. Today, we know that Babylonians didn't just predict eclipses, they had created history's first truly international scientific tradition. Their knowledge had traveled from Mesopotamia to Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to the Islamic world, and from the Islamic world to Western Europe. It was scientific globalization millennia before the concept existed. The Babylonian achievement represents something profound about human knowledge. Truly revolutionary ideas transcend the civilizations that create them. The mathematical principles developed in ancient Mesopotamia became the foundation for all subsequent astronomy, from Ptolemy to Newton to Einstein. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw an ordered, predictable universe, he was confirming a vision that Babylonians had developed using only their intelligence, mathematics, and determination to understand the cosmos. It was the final triumph of science over ignorance, a triumph that had begun in the brick towers of ancient Mesopotamia. The story of Babylonian astronomy teaches us that scientific progress isn't linear or culturally bound. Knowledge advances, retreats, gets lost, and is rediscovered. But mathematical truth has a way of persisting across millennia, waiting for minds capable of recognizing its power. In our age of rapid technological advancement, the Babylonian legacy reminds us that the most profound scientific achievements aren't always the most recent ones. Sometimes, the greatest innovations are the rediscovery of ancient wisdom, expressed in the universal language of mathematics that connects all human understanding across time and culture. And so concludes this incredible journey through one of history's greatest scientific achievements, a revolution in human understanding that Europe would spend over a millennium trying to match. The Babylonian legacy proves that genius knows no geographical boundaries or historical periods. It emerges wherever human curiosity meets mathematical precision. What other ancient civilizations do you think achieved scientific breakthroughs we've overlooked or forgotten? Hit that like button if this series has blown your mind about ancient scientific achievements. Subscribe for more incredible stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history. And let me know in the comments, has this changed your perspective on where scientific innovation really comes from? See you in the next video exploring more hidden gems of human genius.